Hey, so I've noticed a feature of YouTube videos is to continually apologize for not uploading enough YouTube videos as if someone else was in control of it. So I'm going with that trend. Like, sorry. Like, I would love to have just constantly been grinding out content recently. I actually would have, but I haven't. And that's not my fault, obviously. But what I have been doing is streaming fairly regularly, kind of not regularly, but fairly regularly, while we build a projection model on stream. There's a playlist with all 5 of the normally 2-hour sessions of just building a projection model. Now, much to everyone's surprise, watching me build a sheet for 2 hours at a time was not as entertaining as you'd think. But the first session was pretty fun. There was a lot of them back and forth about how, and then there was a lot of me doing it. Hopefully, if anyone's really interested in, you can get some of the technical details in by watching it. I did try to commentate as I was doing stuff, but some of it is just simple how-to stuff, as in the how-to playlist. But we finished 5 stream sessions, and I did one pretty hefty one by myself to do lots of the how that we'd already set up, just because it was a lot of filling in blanks, like calculating reception points using receptions. Like, you know how to multiply numbers together, so I didn't really feel like filling in a lot of those blanks was really stream worthy. And also I just wanted to kick us along a little bit because I didn't know how long it was going to take. In the end, it took probably 8-10 hours to build a pretty decent, I think, model that does a pretty decent job at base price, if you will, for a basic bitch model, to create projections. Made a few modifications, a few little regressions to give us a rough guide of what players should do the following season. There are still some outliers, and that's the thing. A projection model is meant to be you impart your bias, your opinion on what's going to happen on the average, because the average tells us at best 50 to 52% of what's going on, and our base model doesn't get close to that, probably 40% accurate in terms of how much we can know, because that's not really what we're going for with the projection model. We're looking to be able to make our own assumptions and then create reasonable projections given the amount of games that we expect, given what's reasonable to expect in terms of team volume, but we also want to break those rules when we need to. For example, the model doesn't know that Drew Brees is gone and Jameis Winston is there. So the model is predicting, or the team regression z-score thing we created is projecting passing attempts based on coaching history, and also using, since we project through players, using that that regressed expectation, then through the players. And so there's no real way that we're influencing it based on who the new quarterback is. Now, while I normally am fine with that, there's a big drop-off between Drew Brees and anyone else. I mean, he's a historical level completion percentage kind of quarterback. And so one modification we tried to make to modify situations, because if you try to write regression models and formulas to account for every situation, then you end up creating a model that adjusts for these situations, and it won't work when you get a new situation. And so that's another reason I keep projection model kind of towards the average. But a changing quarterback is a thing that happens fairly relatively often. It happens fairly often. So what I did is adjusted catch percentage based on ADOT, based on quarterback history. Now, it's not a big nudge, but when you move from Drew Brees to Jameis Winston, the completion percentage over 11 and under 11 ADOT adjusts slightly based on those quarterbacks' history. And again, not a lot. It was just a little tiny nudge just to push us a little closer towards a reasonable expectation, and then you impart your own assumptions onto it, like Jameis Winston's going to have the best year ever, or Taysom Hill is actually going to be the quarterback, however you want to go with it. So the difference between, in my head, creating a model versus a projection model or a projection machine is that it's meant to represent within guide rails of what's reasonable, of what has happened in the past, what you actually think is going to happen. Now, I caution you towards going to extremes. Like if you're looking at running backs, projecting 70% of teams' rushing attempts is basically the elite of the elite level running back. Like only Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey type running backs get that much of the team's rushing volume. And the same way that races over one for wide receiver are relatively rare. You really only want to be projecting that level of efficiency in receiving at the tippy top, and there has to be some level of history to back that up, but that's me. And the guide rails of the model itself, or the machine itself, does do some of that, but you can also just throw caution to the wind. There are other exceptions which we could write out, but then given this is one specific instance, in another specific instance it wouldn't work, and so back to the basic bitch strategy we want to do. I didn't write something to work it out, but Deebo Samuels has an exceptional level of efficiency in Racer based on a relatively marginal history so far. Like he's got a 2.89 Racer average the model or the projection machine wants to give him as a projection. That's too much. You give him any level of target share and he gets 1,700 yards with that kind of racer. So you already have to default that down to at least one. One's a really good racer, even for a lower ADOT player than, say, Brandon Ayuk. So there will be some exceptions, especially if you maintain it, update it, change it, modify it. And that's my idea with the thing, that it's a experience of building one so you can create your own, or you can take this and continually modify it and add things. There are a bunch of things I would want to do with it if it was mine, and it isn't now mine. I guess I will start from this point and modify it the ways I prefer, to start creating my yearly projections. To be honest with you, there's no reason not to. It's a very solid starter, and the additions you want to make on it, some are preference, some are what you want to automate, some are what you don't want to automate. For example, we're estimating depth chart positions, but you have to manually input them. You could start scraping some site that you trust for depth chart positions, or even the team's depth chart, and importing that in instead of making the assumption yourself. Or you could create some kind of model or predictive equation or function in Excel to calculate how many games a player is going to play. If you know a lot about injury history, if you know someone who does know a lot about injury history, you could change those two things. As it is, in our basic version, you just manually input, okay, Deshaun Jackson's going to play 5 games, and Jonathan Taylor's going to play 17, because it's now 17. Now that gets me to why I'm making this video after the stream has finished. Because one thing that I noticed, and I kind of noticed at the time, but I just couldn't quite process how to fix it, was we're projecting per game stats and then we're multiplying by the games we're expecting them to play into yearly stats. But that's not really projecting on a per game basis, because if you think AJ Green going to Arizona in 2021, if this is in the future, hey, how did that work out? But we assume that when he's on the field, he's probably going to get 18% target share. Probably not. That's probably not what you think. But say you wanted to say he was going to get a large role when he's healthy and on the field. You want to say he gets an 18% target share. Because we're multiplying per game stats into yearly stats, what you essentially have to do is say he gets 5 to 8% yearly stats, and then he plays 10 games in order to try and get his yearly numbers right. But that's kind of counterintuitive, and you have to backtrack what you actually and therefore you're creating a projection based on the result that you want, and that's not really what you want to be able to do. You want to say he's going to get 18% targets in the games he plays, and he's going to play 5 games, and therefore work out what that is seasonally. And I hadn't built that in, and so I have now, and I've re-uploaded the projection model, and I'm going to show you the change I made, and also just walk you through some of the other basics that we created, just in case you didn't watch all 8 hours, or whatever it turned out to be of that stream, to give you an introduction, or just a summation of the thing that I fixed now. And if you follow the link in the description, it goes straight to this model, and I'm just going to keep it there on Google Sheets. You can make your own copy with it, add it, as I do with my databases, add to it, change it, and then come back and get a new copy of the original one if you screw it up or decide you want to go in a different direction, or just cuts, right? So that's the way I'm going to run it. And let's take a look. I'll show you the difference and how I did it because that's this whole thing. How do I do things? Find your own way, but this is how what I came up with to do it. Yeah. So this is a stream model, I called it. Fancy, right? This is a basic page, and obviously there are a lot of columns here, but building them one by one, I hope watching it on stream, it's very simply just you start to add things that you need. I need to see target share, I need to see team attempts, and eventually it gets up to such a high number it looks like it was hard to do, but really it's how to eat an elephant. It's one column at a time. Wait, one bite at a time. So what did I change? Let me just unfreeze the view here. So what we're doing is using a player history plus a few regression models that we built, or formulas that we created, to create basic stats, like a yards per carry stat or a catch percentage stat, using those adjustments that I mentioned, and their average ADOT so far in their career. And if they don't have a history, it defaults to this average tab. It looks up their position and just grabs the average. A pretty decent average that we came up. Again, this is an improvement that you could make. You could create a whole bunch of different averages, or you could ask it to calculate different types of averages in the stream model itself. So instead of just a basic wide receiver ADOT, you could create a basic wide receiver ADOT for a wide receiver drafted in the first round who had 7 point whatever yards per target in college. You just have to add that data and then ask it to recalculate. As it is, it's just grabbing a simple average wide receiver, running back, or quarterback, depending on what the actual stat is. We've also got some average touchdown stats over here. I realize now that this is... There we go. So over in this section, we also have some basic touchdown stats in the passing game, rushing game, receiving game, just in case the player doesn't have enough of a history yet to actually create an average for the players themselves. All right. So where was I? Anyway, so those are the player stats. It then runs through these team averages, where we use the team or the situation to look for a reasonable expectation in that situation or for that team level of usage. Now, it doesn't use these averages too much. If it's DeAndre Hopkins, you don't want to bring it down to the Arizona wide receiver 1 average, because his average is a lot higher than most wide receiver 1s anywhere, and so it doesn't do too much to it. But in the case of a lack of history, and just to give it a nudge, a little elbow, a little wink. I don't know why I'm trying to wink. I don't wink very well, but towards what should be reasonable to expect for the team. Again, this is an area you could improve if you want to lean more heavily on team usage bias. Like Carolina doesn't throw to running backs. You can rack it down. You can create a different regression formula. As it is, it just gives it a little sway towards what the team average is or what the situation average is, which is where I put these quarterback adjustments. So if the quarterback on average completes 68% of his passing attempts to players with an ADOT over 11, it nudges their catch percentage, if their ADOT is over 11, towards that 68 number if it happens to be lower, or it brings it down if their completion percentage happens to be higher. How much? Not much. It's basically the average of their catch percentage to the quarterbacks. And if their ADOT is below 11, then it does the same thing, but for that lower level of quarterback history. So it's not doing a lot, but it's doing enough just to nudge it in the direction you want to go as a basic model, so that then you can impart, well, actually this player is going to complete like 80% of his passes because he's of his catches because he's Michael Thomas, or 55% because he's bad, right? But that's where the assumptions come in, but that's not what I want to get to. We're also importing these regression predicted points per game and rushing attempts per game, and we created a little z-score regression model to predict not what actually is going to happen, but what is reasonable to expect based on who the head coach is, the last 5 years of their history, how sticky their passing attempts and rushing attempts have been over the years, and then calculating z-score, and we learned how to bolt all that together into a reasonable regression. And we're doing it on a points per game basis because the season's now expanded to 17 games anyway, so we need to be able to change it up from 16 to 17, and also it's just a good idea to go through points per game because some players aren't going to play a full season, and that's actually just a little bit more of a sophisticated model than I think just projecting yearly stats is. In fact, if you want to enter your stats anywhere, they will probably ask for points per game stats, not yearly stats, So inside baseball, you'll need points per game stats, and you don't just want to divide by 16 or whatever, because that's not what you actually think. All right. So we've also got the coaching history in here, just that you could update for next year, or when the coaching staff changes on a team, the head coach moves from one team to another, you can switch it up, re-identify their new team, and it would update. Again, the idea of this is as a starter so that you can hopefully build one of your own, or use it to advance into your own actual projection machine, we'll call it. But that will require that you update more information, right? So we'd need more passing attempts as more years go by. So you would have to add that, but the formulas in here are live, so as long as you add the data, it should recalculate the z-score and the using their present r-squared. You could also retest r-squared, but again, we talked about this on stream for a lot longer, but that's what that's doing. All right, so it's got team stats on a per game basis in here as well. And then it projects on a per game basis what their target share is. So we're assuming what their target share is in the games that they're playing. And then we're going to convert that to yearly stats. All right, now what I was doing before, because I just couldn't think live how to fix it, was projecting target share and then multiplying it by the number of games that we were expecting them to play. Instead, what I've done is the assumptions you make are their per game stats. And then what I do is I divide the number of games we project by the total number of games, which is a little helper box up here. Right now it's set at 17, and that creates a percentage of games available. And so if they're playing 17, they get a 1, and their per game target share or rushing percentage share that you assume will be 1-to-1, so it would be exactly the same. But if you project them to play 8, then it would be half of those games, and therefore they get half of that projection, which works out mathematically to creating a seasonal projection in terms of volume, where you can still assume per game stats. So that sounded more complicated than I thought it was going to be. So put it this way. What I essentially created was this interface called the Assumptions tab. It was originally all built in the Streamer tab, but then I realized having to look across everything at the same time was just a little too overwhelming. It wasn't tidy and it wasn't easy. So I created this Assumptions tab where you can copy and paste the first 4 columns once you've manicured the depth chart, because I keep finding players that are actually free agents or have moved team that I've forgotten about. So the depth charts do take manicuring in that way. But when you have them set, you can copy and paste these first 4 columns into the Assumptions tab, and then you start your projections. So you can start making assumptions about rushing volume and target volume, and then you make assumptions about efficiency. How many yards per carry they're going to get, what is their racer going to be, that's receiver error conversion ratio, essentially efficiency for receiving based on air yards. So we're using air yards to project, because air yards are better to use than most traditional stats. I wish we had something better than yards per carry, but we don't, or at least I don't. The final 2 sections are receiving and rushing touchdown, so touchdown efficiency. And what I converted this to, instead of like a touchdown percentage, which I think is normally how we are told about touchdown efficiency, they're catching 3% touchdown rate or whatever, but that doesn't make intuitive sense to me, or it doesn't to me when I first started doing projections. I don't know if 5% is high. I don't know if 20% is high. These all sound like fairly low numbers. I want like 90 and 70% numbers, So what does that mean? So instead I converted it to actual yardage. So how many yards does a player have to receive or rush for before they get a touchdown? And again, for each of these sections, I've got a 3-year history, so it's importing that player's history in each of the stats. Then it's showing you what the projection model is actually giving them, and then you can override it in these little yellow columns here. So right now, James Conner is projected to get a receiving touchdown for every 290 receiving yard. And you can see back in 2019, it was at 83 yards per touchdown, and in 2018 it was at 493, so you can see why it's taking this random number. But also, because you are smarter than an Excel sheet, you know there's a reason that these 2 numbers are drastically similar, as a rookie behind Le'Veon Bell versus getting the role himself. So 290 is probably too high. if you think he's a running back one. If not, then you don't care. But if he's going to be the guy getting the workload, and that's the assumptions you've made about his volume, you could also pull this back down to 100. So not as good as his best year in 2019, but still catching a touchdown for every 100 yards in receiving for a running back sounds pretty good. And I know that just from my experience playing fantasy. I don't have to have a backlog of making projections in my mind to know that a touchdown per 100 receiving yards sounds okay. Doesn't sound great. You expect Alvin Kamara to catch more than one touchdown per 100 yards, but for James Conner, it's fine. And even if that doesn't make more sense to you, then you can flick to the average tab, and you can go look at receiving yards or receiving touchdown shares for running backs, which is this row right here, and you see that the average for running backs is actually around 197. And that's your average running back. If you're assuming a running back getting significant volume, who's going to be the running back one, who is actually pretty decent pass catcher, you can understand how you could come down off that average to 100, and that'd be fairly accurate. And if that isn't good enough guide for you, then you could go into the player history tab and just go look up different running backs, or just go look at running backs in general with certain volume numbers to get a sense of what you feel comfortable with that James Conner, or the receiver James Conner is going to do in touchdowns per receiving yards. And you could do that for target share and rushing share and yards per carry as well, but I just thought I'd explain it through touchdown rates, since I'm doing it what I hope is a more intuitive sense, that you don't have to do too much background research if you've just played fantasy fairly a fair amount. Then you have a decent idea of how many touchdowns you would expect, or how many yards you would expect for a touchdown for the different positions. For example, if a wide receiver catches 100 yards, you'd be pretty surprised, no matter who they are, if they don't get a touchdown. Whereas a running back, if they get 50 yards one game and 50 yards another game, are you surprised if they don't have a touchdown either game? Not as surprised, right? So you could even bump that to 120. The model certainly likes it better than the 100 I was putting in. Or you can put it whatever number you wanted. Same with the rushing touchdown rate. So with rushing touchdowns, you'd expect a running back to be more efficient in rushing the ball per touchdown than receiving the ball. And right now the models, or the base projection, is giving James Conner a touchdown per 133 rushing yards. That sounds fairly high to me. If a running back gets a 100-yard game, you'd expect him to have a touchdown. If he gets a 130-yard game, you'd expect him to have a touchdown. But remember, that's per every 133 yards. So if your expectation is Connor's going to run for 70 yards a game, then that makes sense. And you can also, again, look at his history here and see that he got 120 rushing yards per touchdown in 2020, 116 in his best year, and 80 yards per touchdown in that limited season where he's playing behind someone else. So again, you could dig back into the averages, you could dig back into different player histories, or you can just use your knowledge of what you think James Conner's going to do to go, it's going to go you back to that shortened sample in 2018. Or much more reasonably, let's just keep it the same as last year, which maybe a little less efficient since he's got competition, he's older, whatever assumption you want to make. You could just leave it at the 133 rushing yards per touchdown. So he has to get his 270-yard rushing games basically before he gets a rushing touchdown. Depends what you think of his season, right? And the model's giving you some level of assumption, which is actually fairly reasonable, again, which should be the story throughout, which then you impart your knowledge on. Now, my basic idea when doing projection is to try and make as few overrides as possible, because I would like it to come naturally from the numbers. But there are some things, like James Conner leading the type of life of a running back behind one other running back when he started his career, then a limited sample in 2020, so on and so forth, where you're going to have to make assumptions. And I've already pointed out, like Deebo Samuel's, his race is just too high. That's just that's just noise in the data. So I've already got that assumption baked in for you. George Kittle had a rushing touchdown once or twice, so it looks like he only needs about 6 rushing yards before he gets a touchdown. And where he's had a history of rushing the ball every now and again, his rushing touchdown weight was too high, and so I've got that basic assumption in there as well. He'll still get rushing attempts projected as base, and he'll still get rushing touchdowns projected as base, but I've taken out the extreme rushing efficiency because I don't expect George Kittle to be getting a rushing touchdown every game. I think that's just some noise in a smaller sample size, right? But still, yeah, you can make as little or much as you want. Now, the other thing I'd say about the volume concerns is I've got this missing volume or missing rushing attempts column here and missing targets here. This is essentially giving you an idea of how much the basic volume you already have projected without making any assumptions so far is over or under our expectation for the team. And you can see for Arizona here, we're expecting too many rushing attempts, which also makes sense because we just added James Conner to the team without doing anything else. We haven't told the model that Chase Edmonds is having James Conner join them. We've just smashed them both onto the same team. And so it's given James Conner 53% of the attempts because he had 53% last year and 54% the year before. And it's like, okay, that's basically what he'll do. And it doesn't know that Chase Edmonds is getting a 23% projection because he was on a team without a James Conner. Now, you could think that James Conner is nothing, in which case, they just signed a veteran, whatever you happen to think. So you can rack his rushing attempts back down to 5, or you can shorten Chase Edmonds' rushing expectation to 15. Now there's a true running back 1 on the team. Whatever you happen to think is going to be the true way that situation plays out. Same with the target share. I've got a missing target column so that while you're making target assumptions, it tells you how close you're getting to the coaching history projection through that Z-score of how many passing attempts and targets we think the team on average should do, a reasonable expectation based on what's happened over the last 5 years and that head coach on that team. So yeah, you also see some teams where there are targets left, not vacated targets, just our model is projecting them to have passed 15 more times than we've currently allocated on the depth chart. So good news, you can give Kyle Pitts in Atlanta some extra passing attempts because we've got more left in the tank. Or you can leave it as it is because you think Atlanta isn't going to throw as much as the model does. Either way, it just gives you some guide rails to know how close you are to what's reasonable. And again, you can be as unreasonable as you like, but it's going to let you know, hey, maybe bring him down a bit. And you can be like, no, model, you don't know what you're talking about. Just like everyone likes to do when talking to their spreadsheet alone in their room. I assume you do that too. All right, same with the rushing attempts, actually. We actually ended up projecting rushing attempts on base. Again, because they just lost all the running backs and signed Mike Davis, and Mike Davis only had 43% of attempts last year because he played a shortened season with Christian McCaffrey starting off the season. So you can rank that up to 50%, which is just an average running back 1. 45 to 50 is an average running back 1 share, whether they're elite or not, to be fair. All right, so you make your volume assumptions, you can make your efficiency assumptions, and you don't have to touch this this whole thing over here at all. You can just tell it how the percentage of rushing attempts you think on a per game basis players are going to get, and target share and how efficient they're going to be, or you can leave the base projection in there if you think it's reasonable, which I try to do as much as possible as a rule. All right, now there are some assumption tabs in the stream mod, like the streamer model, this first tab here. Like I left catch percentage because I think it does, there's no real need unless there's an extreme outlier to really adjust catch percentage or an interception percentage or ADOT because that's fairly sticky and relatively rarely. It would be really hard to say you accurately predict a large change in a player's ADOT. It doesn't really happen that much despite Juju Smith-Schuster. And passing attempts, I'm mostly just having it take care of itself, to be honest, because there's not a need to do that for every team, and I wanted to keep this assumption tab as clean and simple as possible, just with the basics in there. And it will create a reasonable projection. So the first two things that we do is assume how many games a player is going to play, however you want to do that. And then their position on the depth chart, and that's going to give them all a basic projection. And then you go to the assumption tabs and make 3 or 4 basic assumptions about every player or the players that you think are relevant to make assumptions about. And it spits out in the export tab these ranks. Now, you could expand this, and obviously the stream model has all of your projections constantly updating. But in the export tab, I have it specifically spitting out quarterback 1 to 32, running back 1 to 75, wide receiver 1 to 100, and tight end 1 to 40. And that updates. So when you change the projections, their rankings change. You don't really need to edit the export tab unless you want to be fair. And so that's just a quick way while you're making assumptions, like I want to say Marcus Brown gets, 50% target share. What does that do to him? Immediately, I can just flick over to the export tab and check out where Marcus Brown goes, which should put him, right there at wide receiver 1, because I'm giving him way too large a share of the targets. And so it's just a quick eye check that you can do to see what that does to their projection pretty quickly without having to filter or sort anything. So yeah, that's it. And it does a pretty good job. I find quarterbacks to be the most frustrating, and where I spend the most of my time doing work, making reasonable expectations, projecting players to play fewer games. Where they're a product of the offense can be difficult, and where sometimes offenses get players added, and the model's just projecting their career rather than their situation, with some slight situation adjustments, and then it can overproject Philadelphia. The reason Jalen Hurts is at the top as base here, for example, don't get too excited, it's because Philadelphia just added a bunch of players who are all now getting a target share projection, which is probably too much to expect on the same team. We're overprojecting the team as a whole. 182 extra targets, for example, are going on. So we have to redistribute the targets as we see fit or as we think is going to happen. We've got 2 tight ends getting 17%, Devontae Smith getting a base level projection based on his draft capital of 11%, Jalen Reagor's getting 16% because we expect him to increase into his second year, or maybe you think he decreases, whatever your assumption happens to be, and it's just all adding up to be too many passing attempts. So that's why Hurts shot to the top. Whereas if you go look at quarterbacks, go look at running backs and wide receivers, the rank should be like, oh yeah, I see why that is, but I want to make different assumptions because that's maybe seeing 50% of what we can expect. And your assumptions, again, will be what really sorts this out for yourself. All right, so that's projections. That's the update I made. And again, the change I made since that stream finished, just in case you watched all of it or you're going to, is you can now make assumptions based on a per game. So in the games they play, they're going to get 20%. And then it will recalculate that to a seasonal target share or rushing attempt share, and therefore rushing yards and receiving yards and touchdowns and everything else from that, based on how many games you say they're going to play. And so now you're purely thinking about when they play, what kind of opportunity level are they going to get, and that's actually projecting on a per game basis instead of just multiplication. So it's a little bit smarter now, or I think it's a little bit smarter. It's a little better. It's going to do more of what you think it's doing intuitively. I don't think many people noticed it wasn't doing that, which is why I just kept leaving it to the back burner, and then I finished the whole stream, and I realized that more was needed, and so I've added it. It was kind of one of those things I just forget. So if you're interested, the way I'm doing it is literally dividing the games you say they're going to play by the full number of seasonal games, and then multiplying the per game target share by that percentage of games that you think they're going to play, and that actually mathematically works out to projecting a seasonal percentage based on how many games you think a player is going to play and their overall volume in those games. I thought it was a pretty neat fix, but there you go. So again, you don't actually have to change anything in the Streamer tab unless you want to. Update, advance, better. Instead, you can now just make reasonable volume expectations and then some efficiency tweaks, and you create your very own projections. Hopefully, is the idea. Again, the link to this is in the description, as it is for every one of those. I don't know why I'm doing this, like they're all above my head, but there you go. Every one of those stream videos in the playlist. The link to this exact sheet on Google Sheets, which you can make your own copy of, download into your own Excel file. I tried to leave everything as blank as possible. As you can see, I haven't got many, blues and oranges, as I like to dot my own sheets with decoration is basically all that is, like this type of thing, because I wanted to leave it as blank as possible, so that you could impart your own style onto it. Also, yeah, it can slow it down, just in case you're running a laptop. Sometimes formatting like that can really slow down any kind of sheet. So I tried to leave it as basic as possible, so you can decorate it how you want. And also, so it was a little easy to run to anyone running a slightly slower system. Again, this should run very easily on everything. A Game Boy should basically be able to run this. But, yeah, that's the end of it, I think. Yeah. Of course, if you have any questions, you can DM me on Twitter or just tag me on Twitter at Pahowdy anytime. Comment on any of those videos or this video. That's what I'm trying to say, on YouTube or Twitch or Periscope or wherever you happen to have found them. I should get a notification. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. And let me know how it goes, I guess. Let me know what projections you spit out. Hopefully you'll have fun doing that. I don't know. Anyway, I'd like to thank everyone that managed to join any of those streams, because lots of sections were very lonely, because very few people have that much time to sit around talking about a sheet, which is perfectly reasonable and understandable. Some people were able to join every stream, and I really appreciate that. And had a great time building it, because I just am a fake nerd, so I do enjoy that kind of thing. But it was especially fun when people were able to chat or offer suggestions or ask questions about it. It made it a lot more fun for me, at least. So I hope you get some value out of it, at least, I guess. Yeah. All right. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you again next time I come up with a video idea, I guess. Yeah. Thanks. Let me know what you think.